They say peace is closer. But the missiles are still flying. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and stand with us as we keep breaking down the biggest political and economic stories shaping your future with clarity, urgency, and truth. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. What we are watching right now is not peace. It is not stability. And it is not a normal negotiation. It is something far more dangerous, a war that is still expanding, while the language of diplomacy begins to flicker around it like a weak light in a storm. That is why this moment matters. Donald Trump says Iranian leaders want a deal so badly, but are afraid to admit it. Tehran says there are no negotiations. Washington says talks are productive. Iran says exchanging messages through mediators does not mean formal talks. At the same time, Israel continues striking across Iran. Hezbollah remains active from Lebanon. The United States is still moving more military power into the region. Oil markets remain on edge. Investors are nervous. Governments are watching the Strait of Hormuz as if the entire global economy is balanced on a razor's edge. This is the true shape of the crisis. What looks like contradiction is actually structure. In modern war, states do not wait for peace before they start bargaining. They bargain through pressure. They signal through force. They test each other with missiles, markets, intermediaries, and public statements designed to shape fear before they shape terms. That is what is happening here. Every side is trying to improve its position before any real agreement takes form. And that means the battlefield and the negotiating table are now part of the same machine. For Americans, this is not some distant regional story that belongs only in foreign policy circles. This reaches directly into daily life. If this war keeps grinding forward, the first shock may not be military. It may be economic. Higher oil. More inflation. More pressure on transport, food, and household costs. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a narrow shipping lane on a map. It is one of the financial pressure valves of the modern world. When that valve tightens, families in the United States feel it, whether they follow Middle East politics or not. But there is something even deeper unfolding here. This is a struggle over narrative control. Trump wants the world to believe American pressure is working. Iran wants to avoid the image of weakness under fire. Israel believes continued force can still reshape the strategic map. No major actor wants to enter a deal looking cornered. That is why the public messaging is so aggressive, so confusing, and so carefully crafted. So let's be honest about where we are. This war is not ending. Not yet. What we are seeing is the opening of a far more unstable phase, where diplomacy exists, but trust does not, where messages are exchanged, but the weapons stay hot, where leaders talk about peace while still calculating how much more leverage they can gain before the next move. And that, in my judgment, is when the world becomes most vulnerable. Trump's message, strength first, talk second. Donald Trump is not speaking about Iran the way a diplomat speaks. He is speaking the way a power broker speaks when he wants the world to understand one thing above all else: pressure comes first, and talks come second. That distinction matters. When Trump says Iranian leaders want a deal so badly, but are afraid to admit it, he is doing far more than describing a hidden diplomatic channel. He is building a hierarchy. He is telling Americans, allies, markets, and Tehran itself that the United States is not chasing negotiations from uncertainty. It is forcing negotiations from strength. In his message, Iran is not acting out of confidence, but out of fear. And that framing is the whole point. This is how political power is presented in wartime. No White House wants to look as though it is searching for an exit because the costs are rising. No president wants to signal that America needs a deal more than its adversary does. So Trump is reversing the image. He is saying, in effect, that Iran is the side seeking relief, Iran is the side under internal strain, and Iran is the side that cannot even publicly admit what it privately knows. That message serves several purposes at once. First, it protects domestic political authority. If the American public sees talks as the product of successful pressure, then Trump appears decisive, commanding, and in control. He is not portrayed as moving toward compromise. He is portrayed as cashing in leverage. In American politics, that difference is enormous. Strength sells. Hesitation does not. Second, it pressures Tehran psychologically. If Washington keeps insisting that Iranian leaders already want a deal, it creates a strategic trap. Either Tehran stays silent and lets the perception grow, or it pushes back harder and risks sounding defensive. In both cases, Trump tries to shape the psychological battlefield before the diplomatic one. He wants the burden of denial to fall on Iran. Third, it reassures allies and unsettles markets in a calculated way. Allies want to believe the United States has a theory of victory, not just a theory of escalation. Markets want signs that some off-ramp exists. Trump's language tries to satisfy both. It says the pressure campaign is working, but it also hints that Washington still controls the ladder upward and downward. But there is a hard risk inside this strategy. The more publicly Trump defines diplomacy as proof of American dominance, the less room he has to adjust if events do not cooperate. If Iran continues resisting, if the war drags on, or if the costs begin to spread faster through oil, shipping, and inflation, then rhetoric can become a prison. A president who says the other side wants a deal badly enough must eventually show results. That is why Trump's message should be understood not as commentary, but as an instrument of war. It is meant to impose a political reality before a final military or diplomatic reality has fully arrived. And yet, there is real strategic logic in it. Coercive diplomacy has always depended on one brutal equation: convince the other side that tomorrow will cost more than today. Trump's message is designed to make that equation impossible for Iran to ignore. The question now is whether pressure can still produce terms, or whether it will only produce a more dangerous round of resistance. Tehran's denial, not just defiance, but survival. Tehran's denial is not just about posture. It is about regime survival. From the outside, it is easy to hear Abbas Araghchi say there are no negotiations and dismiss it as propaganda, stubbornness, or empty defiance. But that misses the real mechanics of power inside a state under fire. When a government is being hit militarily, pressured economically, and watched by its own public, every word becomes part of an internal struggle. In that kind of system, admitting talks too early can be more dangerous than absorbing another round of external pressure. That is the core issue here. Iran is not only managing a confrontation with Washington. It is managing the political consequences of appearing vulnerable in front of its own power centers. And in a crisis like this, those power centers matter just as much as missiles. Donald Trump says Iranian leaders want a deal but are afraid to admit it because they fear retaliation. He is using that line as political pressure, but beneath the rhetoric there is a serious strategic truth. In wartime, leaders do not negotiate only with foreign enemies. They also negotiate with generals, security institutions, ideological hardliners, clerical networks, bureaucratic rivals, and the larger mythology of national resistance. In other words, Tehran is not responding to one audience. It is responding to several at once, and the most dangerous one may be internal. That is why Abbas Araghchi's wording matters so much. By insisting that messages through mediators do not amount to formal negotiations, he is trying to defend political space. He is drawing a line between tactical communication and strategic concession. That distinction may sound thin to outsiders, but inside a pressured regime it can mean the difference between controlled flexibility and perceived surrender. This is where the power structure becomes critical. States like Iran do not survive on military force alone. They survive on narrative discipline. They survive by convincing elites and citizens that the leadership still acts from sovereignty, not fear. The moment that image cracks, every faction begins recalculating. Hardliners push for more resistance. Opportunists protect their own positions. Rivals sense weakness. Public anger deepens. External enemies press harder. That is why denial, in this case, is not simply a lie. It is a shield. There is also a financial layer to this. A state under pressure does not want to signal that its leverage is collapsing. Iran still holds strategic assets that matter deeply to the region and the global economy, above all its position around the Strait of Hormuz and its regional network of influence. If Tehran publicly accepts Washington's framing too early, it weakens the market value of its own bargaining power. In plain terms, it lowers its own negotiating price before the real deal is even on the table. History is full of governments that denied contacts right up until the moment an agreement became politically survivable. That is often how real diplomacy begins in hard conflicts. Not with handshakes, but with denials. Not with trust, but with controlled ambiguity. So Tehran's message should be understood clearly. This is not a simple refusal to talk. It is an attempt to avoid talking from humiliation. Iran may be probing, testing, and calculating. But it wants any future move to look like a sovereign choice, not an act of submission under American pressure. And until that balance changes, its public denial will remain not just defiance, but survival. The 15-point U.S. plan versus Iran's counterlogic. The reported 15-point U.S. plan is being presented as a pathway to peace. In reality, it looks much closer to an attempt to redesign the balance of power after the war while the war is still being fought. That distinction is everything. On paper, the logic sounds straightforward. Washington wants Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium removed. It wants enrichment halted. It wants Iran's ballistic missile program curbed. It wants Tehran to cut off support for regional allied forces. To many Americans, that may sound reasonable, even overdue. A country accused for years of building strategic leverage through nuclear capacity, missile reach, and regional networks is now being told to step back from all of it at once. The White House can frame that as peace through discipline. Donald Trump can frame it as a necessary correction. Supporters can frame it as common sense. But power is never that simple. What Washington is offering is not just a ceasefire formula. It is a conversion plan. It seeks to turn military pressure into political restructuring. It seeks to use the current battlefield moment not only to stop the shooting, but to strip Iran of the very instruments that made it a regional force in the first place. That is why the gap is so wide. The two sides are not merely haggling over conditions. They are fighting over the meaning of surrender, sovereignty, and future power. From the American side, the strategic logic is clear. If the United States accepts a narrow ceasefire without deeper structural limits, then Iran survives the war with too much of its strategic toolkit intact. It would still have uranium leverage. It would still have missile leverage. It would still have regional influence. It would still have the ability to threaten the Strait of Hormuz and shape markets through fear. From Washington's perspective, that would mean absorbing the costs of war without securing a durable strategic outcome. No administration wants that. No White House wants to spend blood, treasure, credibility, and political capital only to arrive at a pause that leaves the core threat architecture standing. So the 15-point concept is built on a harder ambition. It tries to move beyond de-escalation and into long-term containment by other means. It is not simply asking Iran to stop. It is asking Iran to become less dangerous in systemic terms. Less nuclear leverage. Less missile leverage. Less regional leverage. Less bargaining leverage. That is what makes the package coherent from a U.S. national security standpoint. But that same coherence is exactly what makes it unacceptable to Tehran under current conditions. Iran does not see uranium, missiles, and regional alliances as optional extras. It sees them as the insurance policy of regime survival. That is the part many Western audiences miss. In Tehran's strategic worldview, those capabilities are not just weapons. They are stored deterrents. They are the political capital that prevents outside powers from dictating terms at will. They are the infrastructure of resistance. And once a state believes those assets are the last wall between pressure and collapse, it will not give them up because the other side calls the proposal reasonable. That is why Abbas Araghchi's posture matters so much. When he insists that exchanged messages do not amount to negotiations, and when Tehran resists the American frame, it is not only about diplomatic language. It is about refusing to validate a process in which the final destination appears pre-written by Washington. Iran understands that if it accepts the premise too early, it may lose not just bargaining ground, but legitimacy at home and leverage abroad. The financial dimension is just as important as the military one. Strategic power in the modern Middle East is not measured only in missiles and militias. It is also measured in what economists would call position value. Iran's position value comes from the costs it can impose, the uncertainty it can generate, and the networks it can activate. Its geography matters. Its ability to pressure energy routes matters. Its ability to influence partner actors across the region matters. Its capacity to disrupt carries market value, not in the moral sense, but in the hard transactional sense of international bargaining. The U.S. plan is designed to shrink that value dramatically. From Tehran's perspective, that makes the American proposal look less like peace and more like forced asset liquidation under fire. That is why Iran's reported counterlogic is so revealing. Tehran has signaled that if there is to be any serious path forward, it must include a permanent end to the war, compensation for destruction, and recognition of sovereignty. It has also reportedly linked the Strait of Hormuz and the Lebanon front to the broader negotiating picture. That is not diplomatic clutter. That is structure. Iran is saying the conflict cannot be reduced to one technical file while the wider regional equation remains tilted against it. In plain terms, Tehran does not want to sign a deal that narrows its options while its adversaries retain theirs. This is where the deepest clash lies. The United States is negotiating as a superior military power trying to lock in gains. Iran is thinking as a pressured state trying to prevent the formalization of weakness. Washington sees the 15-point framework as the start of stability. Tehran sees it as the codification of vulnerability. History tells us that proposals like this rarely succeed on the first pass, because both sides are still pricing the future differently. The United States appears to believe that more pressure could still produce more concessions. Iran appears to believe that endurance can still preserve core assets. Israel appears to believe that continued military action can further reshape the strategic map. As long as each actor thinks tomorrow may improve its bargaining hand, today's proposals remain unstable. This is one of the oldest truths in war and diplomacy. Negotiations do not fail only because leaders hate each other or refuse to compromise. They fail because the incentive structure has not matured. If one side believes it can gain more by holding out, and the other side believes it can impose more by pressing harder, the documents may circulate, the mediators may move, and the back channels may stay active, but the deal itself remains out of reach. There is also a lesson here from economic statecraft. In financial crises, parties rarely agree when one side is trying to restructure debt and the other side still believes it can recover value by waiting. Strategic conflict works the same way. The 15-point U.S. plan is, in effect, a demand for a deep restructuring of Iran's strategic balance sheet. Iran is resisting because it does not accept the valuation being imposed on its future. Washington is saying your assets must shrink for the system to stabilize. Tehran is saying your terms are a mechanism to institutionalize my weakness. That is why the language around this plan has been so loaded. The White House speaks in terms of military defeat, productive talks, and consequences if Iran refuses to accept reality. Tehran speaks in terms of sovereignty, resistance, compensation, and the refusal to negotiate under coercion. These are not just rhetorical choices. They reflect two different models of order. One says peace comes when power is reduced. The other says peace comes when humiliation is avoided. For Americans watching this from afar, the crucial point is simple. The obstacle is not communication. The obstacle is structural incompatibility. Washington wants a settlement that transforms Iran's future capabilities. Iran wants a settlement that preserves enough of those capabilities to remain politically and strategically alive. That is not a small disagreement. That is the central fracture line of the entire crisis. So when people ask whether the 15-point plan can work, the honest answer is this: only if both sides come to believe that the next phase of war will cost more than the concessions they currently reject. We are not there yet. The United States still believes pressure can improve the offer. Iran still believes endurance can improve the price. And until that equation changes, every proposal will remain what it is now, not a bridge to peace, but a battlefield in diplomatic form. Hormuz, the choke point that turns war into global economic shock. The Strait of Hormuz is where military pressure becomes economic shock. It is the place where geography stops being a map and starts becoming a weapon. For many Americans, Hormuz can sound distant, abstract, almost technical. But that is a mistake. This narrow passage is one of the central arteries of the global energy system. A massive share of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas moves through it. When that artery tightens, the shock does not stay in the Gulf. It moves through fuel markets, shipping insurance, freight costs, food prices, interest rate expectations, consumer confidence, and political stability. In other words, when Hormuz is under pressure, the whole world begins paying a premium for fear. That is exactly why this crisis is so dangerous. Donald Trump's reported present from Iran, the limited safe passage of several fuel tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, was important not because it solved anything, but because it exposed the true balance of leverage. Tehran did not offer a broad reopening. It did not surrender control. It did not remove the threat hanging over global trade. What it did was far more strategic. It showed that it could loosen pressure selectively, in measured doses, on its own terms. That is not de-escalation in the full sense. That is controlled signaling. And markets understand the difference. Oil does not rise only when supply is physically cut off. Oil rises when traders believe disruption is possible, likely, or politically useful to someone with leverage. This is one of the oldest truths in energy economics. Price is not just about barrels. It is about uncertainty. It is about insurance against instability. That is why even a partial gesture, even a few tankers moving safely, cannot calm the system for long if the wider structure remains unstable. The market sees the same reality strategists see. Iran still holds a hand on one of the world's most sensitive economic pressure points. That gives Tehran something incredibly valuable in wartime: scalable leverage. It can threaten without fully closing. It can intimidate without committing to permanent shutdown. It can create pain in gradients. And that matters because the most effective coercion is often not total disruption, but controlled unpredictability. A complete closure would be dramatic, but selective pressure can be smarter. It keeps governments guessing. It keeps prices elevated. It keeps the world aware that Iran still has tools that cannot be bombed away easily. For the United States, Hormuz is the test of whether military strength can produce economic reassurance. That is a much harder task than it sounds. Warships can patrol. Aircraft can deter. Officials can promise stability. But none of that automatically restores confidence if the route itself remains politically contested. And confidence is the real currency here. Once confidence breaks, inflation follows. That is why Hormuz matters so deeply to ordinary Americans. This is not only about foreign policy, and it is not only about oil companies. It is about whether a conflict thousands of miles away will hit the cost of filling a truck, moving groceries, running a business, or heating a home. Hormuz is not just a choke point. It is the place where war reaches into the American economy before most people even realize it has arrived. Lebanon, Abu Dhabi, and the expanding arc of conflict. The war is no longer confined by the language used to justify it. That is the real danger now. Once a conflict begins to spread across multiple fronts, it stops being a single military campaign and starts becoming a regional stress test. Lebanon, Abu Dhabi, and central Israel are no longer side notes to the main story. They are proof that this crisis is expanding outward in ways that make control harder, miscalculation easier, and the final cost much higher. Lebanon is central to that shift. Hezbollah is still active, Israel is still striking in southern Lebanon and near Beirut, and Benjamin Netanyahu's language about expanding a larger buffer zone in the south is not just tactical language. It signals something deeper. Buffer zones are rarely just about immediate defense. They often become instruments for reshaping security geography, widening strategic depth, and normalizing longer-term control under the banner of necessity. That is why such language matters. It tells us the war is no longer being managed only as a matter of response. It is also being framed as an opportunity to alter the map of power. Naeem Qassem's position shows the opposite side of that same equation. When he says negotiating with Israel under fire would amount to surrender, he is not merely rejecting diplomacy. He is protecting the political legitimacy of continued resistance. Movements like Hezbollah do not survive by appearing flexible at the wrong moment. They survive by persuading their base that endurance itself is honor, that resistance is identity, and that compromise under pressure is weakness. That makes the Lebanon front especially combustible, because both sides are now defending not just territory, but political narratives they believe are essential to survival. Then there is Abu Dhabi. The deaths caused by debris from an intercepted missile were not just a tragic byproduct of regional warfare. They were a signal. The Gulf is being reminded that distance is no guarantee of safety. Once civilians in major urban centers begin dying from fallout linked to the conflict, governments across the region face a new level of pressure. They must reconsider air defense, strategic coordination, economic contingency planning, and the political cost of appearing exposed. That changes the psychology of the war. It broadens the number of states that now feel directly touched by it. The strike effects in Kfar Qasim reinforce the same point. This is what expanding conflict looks like in real life: damaged homes, injured civilians, interrupted routines, growing fear, and a public that begins to experience the war not as a headline, but as a personal condition. That is when escalation becomes politically harder to reverse. In strategic terms, this is horizontal escalation. The war is not only becoming more intense. It is becoming more geographically distributed. And once that happens, every additional front creates new triggers, new mistakes, and new demands for response. For the United States, that matters enormously. A wider conflict means more pressure on partners, more risk to energy routes, and more chances that American power will be pulled from deterrence into direct management. This is how regional wars become systemic crises. Not all at once, but front by front, city by city, signal by signal. And once that arc expands, bringing it back under control becomes far more difficult than starting it ever was. The economic war, oil, inflation, supply chains, and public anxiety. This war is now fighting on two fronts at once. One front is military. The other is economic. And for most ordinary people, the second one may arrive first. When oil pushes above the psychological threshold of $100 a barrel, it does more than shake traders in London or New York. It sends a message through the entire global system: instability now has a price, and everyone is about to help pay it. That is the deeper meaning of this crisis. The missiles may be falling in the Middle East, but the economic consequences do not stay there. They move through fuel, freight, food, insurance, credit, and public confidence. This is how a regional war becomes a household problem in America. Energy is not just another commodity. It is the base layer under almost every other cost in the economy. When oil rises sharply, trucking gets more expensive. Air travel gets more expensive. Shipping gets more expensive. Warehousing gets more expensive. Farm equipment gets more expensive to run. Groceries become harder to move and harder to afford. Businesses that were already operating on thin margins begin to absorb pressure they cannot easily pass on forever. And then comes the second wave: public anxiety. Consumers pull back. Investors grow defensive. Political leaders start sounding more urgent because they know the damage is no longer theoretical. That is the real structure of an energy shock. It does not stay contained inside the fuel market. It spreads outward like stress through a cracked foundation. We have seen this before in history, but the current system may be even more vulnerable. In the 1970s, oil shocks exposed how fragile advanced economies could become when energy supply collided with geopolitical conflict. Today, the system is faster, tighter, and more psychologically reactive. Supply chains are more interconnected. Market reactions are more immediate. Political trust is thinner. Central banks are still living with the memory of recent inflation fights, which means any new energy spike carries more than financial risk. It carries political risk. That is why governments are already reacting. Japan has released strategic reserves. Australia is scrambling around fuel demand and transport stress. The Philippines is searching for energy relief through outside supply. Airlines are adjusting routes and schedules. These are not random policy moves. They are early warning signs of a system bracing for sustained pressure. And Americans should take this seriously, because the United States is not economically insulated from a Gulf crisis just because it is geographically distant from it. Global energy prices still shape American inflation. Global shipping stress still influences American supply costs. Global fear still feeds into American markets. A family in Ohio or Arizona may never study the Strait of Hormuz, but they will understand what it means when gasoline rises, food edges higher, and the sense of stability begins to weaken. This is why economic warfare matters so much in modern geopolitics. You do not need to bomb a factory in America to increase pressure inside the American system. You only need to rattle the arteries of global trade badly enough that prices do the political work for you. That is the danger now. This conflict is not just testing armies. It is testing endurance, affordability, and the emotional tolerance of entire societies. And once a war begins to rewrite the public mood through rising costs, it stops being only a foreign crisis. It becomes a domestic reckoning. The power map, China, Pakistan, the UN, G7, and the limits of alignment. To understand this war, you have to look beyond the missiles and into the structure of power forming around them. No major conflict in the Middle East stays local for long. It begins in one theater, but the consequences move through capitals, alliances, trade routes, and rival visions of world order. That is why China, Pakistan, the United Nations, and the G7 all matter here. Not because they control the battlefield, but because they shape the limits of what the battlefield can ultimately produce. China's role is especially important because Beijing is not approaching this crisis as a moral referee. It is approaching it as a strategic power with deep interests in stability, energy flow, and the prevention of unchecked American advantage. When Chinese officials speak of a glimmer of hope, they are not just calling for peace in the abstract. They are signaling support for a diplomatic outcome that prevents wider disorder without allowing Washington to turn military pressure into a clean geopolitical victory. China wants calm, but it wants a balance-based calm, not a winner-takes-all settlement designed by the United States. Pakistan's position is different, but highly revealing. The moment a state becomes a mediator, it gains more than relevance. It gains access. And access is power. By serving as a channel for messages, Pakistan is not merely carrying words between capitals. It is placing itself inside the architecture of crisis management. That can elevate its diplomatic weight, increase its strategic value to major players, and give it influence over tone, sequence, and timing. Mediation is never neutral in the full sense. It is often the art of becoming indispensable without appearing dominant. Then there is the United Nations. Its warnings about a wider war are morally serious and strategically correct. But the UN's position also reveals one of the central weaknesses of the current international system: legitimacy without enforcement. It can name the danger. It can urge diplomacy. It can appoint envoys. But it cannot force major actors to prefer restraint over leverage when those actors still believe pressure may improve their final position. That does not make the UN irrelevant. It makes it a mirror. It reflects the gap between what the world knows is dangerous and what the strongest states are still willing to risk. The G7 adds another layer. These are America's closest partners in broad strategic terms, yet even among allies there are visible limits to alignment. That matters. Coalition politics always look strongest in opening statements and weakest when the economic costs begin to spread. Europe, Japan, and other partners are not only thinking about military logic. They are thinking about inflation, shipping, energy vulnerability, domestic unrest, and the possibility that a prolonged war will destabilize their own political systems. Quiet concern inside alliances is often the first sign that battlefield momentum is not translating smoothly into diplomatic control. And that is the larger point. The United States may still hold overwhelming force, but force is not the same as settlement power. Settlement power requires aligned allies, credible mediators, manageable markets, and a political endgame others can live with. Right now, that alignment does not fully exist. China wants restraint on different terms. Pakistan wants relevance. The United Nations wants diplomacy before catastrophe. The G7 wants to avoid paying for a wider war. This is not a unified map. It is a fractured one. And when the map around a war is fractured, even the strongest actor can discover that winning battles is easier than building order after them. What comes next? 3 plausible paths and the real strategic test. What comes next will not be decided by rhetoric. It will be decided by thresholds. The threshold of pain each side can still absorb. The threshold of risk each side is still willing to take. And the threshold at which political leaders decide that continuing the war costs more than trying to end it. That is the real strategic test now. There are 3 plausible paths ahead, and none of them are clean. The first path is a limited diplomatic off-ramp. This would not look like a dramatic peace ceremony or a sudden breakthrough. It would look smaller, colder, and more fragile than that. More messages through mediators. More carefully calibrated gestures. More selective restraint around the Strait of Hormuz. More public denial paired with private contact. In this scenario, Donald Trump keeps saying pressure is working, Abbas Araghchi keeps refusing the language of formal negotiation, and both sides slowly move toward a formula that reduces immediate danger without resolving the deeper conflict. This is the kind of outcome governments accept when they need time more than trust. It would not end the struggle. It would only lower the temperature. The second path is a prolonged coercive standoff, and right now, this looks like the most likely one. In this scenario, the war does not fully widen, but it does not truly cool down either. Strikes continue. Messages continue. Oil remains volatile. Markets remain nervous. Washington keeps trying to turn military pressure into political leverage. Tehran keeps trying to avoid the appearance of capitulation while preserving its strategic assets. Israel continues to calculate that more force may still improve its position. This is the dangerous middle zone of modern conflict, where nobody fully backs down because nobody yet believes the price of continuing has become unbearable. Wars can last a long time in this zone. Not because they are stable, but because they are just unstable enough to keep every side gambling on one more move. The third path is wider regional escalation. This is the path that begins when leaders think they are managing risk, but are actually accumulating it. More fronts become active. Lebanon grows hotter. Gulf states face more direct fallout. The United States, after moving more military assets into the region, finds itself with more options and therefore more temptation. At that point, a conflict that was once described as containable begins to mutate into a broader regional confrontation with global economic consequences. Oil shocks deepen. Alliance strains grow sharper. Domestic politics in multiple countries begin to harden. This is the path where strategic control starts to crack. So which path is most likely? My judgment is this: the near future points to the second scenario, a prolonged coercive standoff with intermittent diplomatic probing. Donald Trump may be right that Iranian leaders want a deal. But wanting a deal is not the same as being able to accept one. A regime can desire relief and still reject terms. A president can want closure and still demand conditions too heavy for the other side to survive politically. That is why desire is not the key variable here. Political survivability is. Americans should understand the stakes clearly. This is no longer just a test of military strength. It is a test of whether power can produce an outcome before pressure produces something worse. If the incentives do not align soon, this war will keep rewriting markets, alliances, and political confidence at the same time. And history is unforgiving in moments like this. When leaders believe they still have room to push, the real danger is not only what they plan. It is what they unleash. In the end, this story is not only about Donald Trump, Abbas Araghchi, Benjamin Netanyahu, or the shifting messages coming out of Washington and Tehran. It is about how power really works when the world is under pressure. Every major actor in this crisis is trying to avoid the appearance of weakness while protecting what matters most to them: survival, leverage, credibility, and control over the future. Trump speaks the language of dominance because he wants Americans and the world to believe strength can force history to move. Tehran speaks the language of denial because no regime under fire wants to admit it may have reached the edge of its endurance. Israel keeps pressing because it believes military momentum can still reshape the regional map. And behind all of it stands the larger truth: wars are never only fought with weapons. They are fought with oil, fear, timing, money, messaging, and the psychology of pride. The Strait of Hormuz, the rising cost of energy, the widening arc of conflict through Lebanon and Abu Dhabi, the caution of China, Pakistan, the United Nations, and the G7, all of these show that this is no isolated clash. It is a system-wide test of leadership, discipline, and consequence. The deepest lesson is this: in life, as in politics, the greatest danger often comes when people refuse to face reality because they are afraid of looking weak. Pride can delay necessary decisions. Ego can raise the cost of conflict. Denial can make a crisis far worse than honesty ever would. For all of us, the practical lesson is clear. We must learn to face hard truths early, manage pressure without panic, and understand that real strength is not stubbornness for its own sake. Real strength is knowing when to hold firm, when to adapt, and when to act before damage becomes irreversible. That lesson applies to families, careers, money, leadership, and daily life. Waiting too long to confront a problem almost always makes the final price higher. Now here's a quick question for you. Do you believe this crisis is more likely to end through pressure or through diplomacy? A. Pressure will force the final outcome. B. Diplomacy will decide the final outcome. Comment A or B below. And what is your own view on this entire story? Do you think Donald Trump's strategy is working, or do you think the region is moving towards something even more dangerous? Share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can read, compare, and learn from each other. And if you want more sharp, deeply researched political and economic analysis like this, subscribe to the channel and support us so we can keep bringing you the next powerful story.